She was just trying to get home. 12 hours on her feet in the ER. Scrubs soaked through. The kind of tired that lives in your bones. And then, a sound. Small. Broken. Coming from behind a dumpster in the dark. She almost kept walking, but Aisha has never once in her life kept walking. What she found crouched in that alley was a little girl, maybe 6 years old, shaking so hard her teeth rattled, wearing a coat that cost more than Aisha's rent, torn at the shoulder, dusted in snow, like something violent had already happened before this moment. Aisha dropped to her knees in the slush, pulled the child into her arms, wrapped her own coat around both of them right there in the freezing cold. And that should have been the end of it. A good deed, a warm cab ride, a hospital check-in. Except 3 men stepped into the mouth of the alley, armed, quiet, not rushing, the way people move when they already know you have nowhere to run. Aisha stood up, slowly, and she spread her arms, wide. She had no weapon, no backup, no plan, just her body between the guns and the child clinging to her back. She stared down the barrel and did not move. That was the moment the black SUVs appeared. 6 of them, sliding silently into the alley like shadows given weight, headlights cutting through the blizzard. And then, the door opened. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He stepped into the snow like a man who has never once in his life been afraid of anything. And his eyes swept the alley and found his daughter alive, wrapped in the arms of a stranger. The 3 armed men were gone before Aisha fully understood what had happened. And then he was standing in front of her. Tall. Still. A face carved from something colder than the storm behind him. Looking at her, the way you look at something that just broke every rule you thought was permanent. His daughter, still trembling, buried her face deeper into Aisha's neck and would not let go. Aisha held the child tighter. He watched that, and something in his jaw shifted. He didn't say, "Thank you." Men like him don't. He said, in a voice so low it barely survived the wind, "Get in the car." Aisha thought it was for one night, one warm room, one cup of tea until the child calmed down enough to be handed off. She didn't know a grieving little girl who hadn't spoken in 3 days was about to whisper one word into her ear and change everything. She didn't know a man who had buried everyone he'd ever trusted was standing in a hallway outside that door, listening and unraveling. And she had absolutely no idea that the danger didn't end in that alley. It followed them home. If that already has your chest tight, good. You're exactly where you're supposed to be. This channel is where Afro-Korean love stories live, the kind that start in the dark and end in something that looks a lot like forever. Stories that cross oceans, survive storms, and refuse to let go. Hit subscribe right now so you don't lose this video, and don't you dare skip. Let's get into the story, and drop a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is reaching. The shot was quiet. That was the thing Aisha couldn't shake. Not later that night, not weeks later, not ever. How quiet it was. 3 men with weapons, and then, between one heartbeat and the next, they were simply not a problem anymore. No exchange, no warning, just Dong-yul raising one hand, and the world rearranging itself around his decision like it had always been willing to do that for him. She stood in the snow. Mi-sun's face was pressed so hard against her throat that she could feel the girl's eyelashes against her pulse. The blizzard kept moving, like nothing had happened, like the rules she had built her entire understanding of the world on hadn't just been quietly suspended. Dong-yul turned from the bodies without looking at them again. He walked toward her, and, up close, he was even harder to process, the kind of face that looked like it had been assembled for a different era entirely. Sharp, still, a jaw that had never once in its life asked for permission. His eyes moved from his daughter to the blood darkening the snow and back to his daughter. He crouched down to Mi-sun's level, said something low in Korean. His hand came up slowly, hovering, careful, the way you'd approach something fragile you were terrified of breaking further. Misun screamed. Not a name, not a word. Just a sound that split the cold air open and sent it bouncing off the brick walls, and her fingers, already white-knuckled in Aisha's coat, twisted into absolute fists and held on like the ground beneath them was moving. Dongyul's hand went completely still. He stayed there, crouched in the snow, and something moved across his face so fast it was almost nothing. Almost. A man watching a door close that he hadn't realized he'd needed to stay open. A man, understanding in real time exactly what the last few years of his choices had cost him. He stood, straightened his coat with one smooth motion. When he looked at Aisha, his voice had no edges left in it. Just instruction. Get in the car. She should have argued. Part of her was already building the argument. I don't know you, I have a life. This child needs a hospital, not whatever you are. But Misun's breathing was still ragged against her neck, and the SUV doors were already open, and the men flanking them had the specific patience of people who had never once been told no and didn't expect tonight to be different. Aisha got in the car. She told herself it was just for the child. That was all. Just until the girl was warm. She was wrong about that. She just didn't know it yet. Here is what nobody prepares you for when you walk into the home of the most powerful man in the city. It is the loneliest place you have ever stood. The elevator opened onto marble floors that threw the light back like a challenge. Furniture arranged with the precision of a showroom. Expensive, deliberate, completely without personality. No photographs anywhere. No shoes left carelessly by the door. No evidence at all that a child's laughter had ever been allowed to bounce off these walls. There was a bedroom. Small, off the main hallway. Someone had been paid to decorate it for a little girl. The right colors, the right shapes, the appropriate toys arranged on shelves in careful rows. But they'd guessed. You could feel the guessing. Every detail technically correct and emotionally absent. Aisha didn't say any of this. She asked for a first aid kit, a thermometer, 2 warm blankets, and hot water with honey. One of the men in dark coats vanished without a word. She carried Misun to the couch, sat down with the girl folded into her lap, and got to work. Hypothermia. Mild. The shivering was still active, which was the good news. Active shivering meant the body was still fighting for itself. She checked fingers, ears, lip color. Wrapped her tight. Held the warmth in and breathed, slow and deliberate, giving Misun's nervous system something steady to follow. Dongyul stood across the room. He hadn't sat. Hadn't removed his coat. He stood with one hand in his pocket and watched Aisha work with an expression she couldn't categorize. Not surveillance, exactly. Something more like a man encountering a phenomenon he didn't have a file for. She needs sleep more than anything else, Aisha said, not looking up. Warm sleep, undisturbed. No more movement tonight. Silence. Understood. And she needs to not be frightened. She looked up then, and she held his gaze without flinching. So, I'm going to need to stay in her room. The apartment held its breath. You're not a prisoner, he said. I didn't say I was. I said I'm staying in her room. She heard him exhale. The very specific exhale of a man recalculating a situation that had stopped cooperating with his expectations. Someone will show you where things are, he said. And then he was gone, and the marble floor absorbed the sound of his footsteps like it had been designed to. Aisha sat in the silence he left behind and looked at the apartment around her. All that careful, expensive emptiness, and thought, whoever lived here before me didn't make it. She didn't know yet how right she was. 3 weeks ago, he wouldn't look at her. Now he couldn't look away. But that morning, the first morning, he tried to buy her. She found him in the kitchen before she'd fully committed to being awake. Suited already, espresso in hand, a checkbook open on the island between them like a negotiation he'd already decided the terms of. He waited until she'd poured her own coffee. Then he slid the checkbook toward her. Amount line blank. Name a number, he said. You stay. You care for her. You are compensated. Aisha looked at the checkbook, looked at him, picked it up, and tore it in half. The sound was deeply satisfying. Dong-yul didn't move, but something in his eyes changed. Not the managed attention he'd been running on her since the alley. The real kind. The kind that meant she'd done something that didn't fit the pattern. I'm not a service, she said, setting both halves on the counter. I'm staying because that little girl held on to me in the dark, and I don't walk away from that. When she doesn't need me, I'll leave. That's it. He was quiet for a moment that had weight to it. Most people who come into this apartment want something from me, he said. I want your espresso machine, she said. Mine broke 2 months ago, and this one is clearly superior. That's the entire list. She watched the corner of his mouth. Just for a second. The ghost of something that had once been a smile and still remembered the shape. He pushed his cup across the island toward her. She took it. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known yet, was that the checkbook had been a test, and she had just become the first person in years to pass it. She didn't set out to change anything. That was what made it so complete. She just existed in a space and left warmth in it the way some people leave fingerprints. Without trying, without realizing, until you look up one day and the evidence is everywhere. A Bluetooth speaker appeared in the kitchen. Music, low and easy, filling the mornings. Mi-sun started eating breakfast with her eyes up instead of down. Small thing. Enormous thing. The hot chocolate ritual began in week 2. Real chocolate, not powder, and marshmallows on evenings that earned them, and the specific honor of being allowed to stir it herself, which Mi-sun had decided was the highest privilege available in this apartment. She was not wrong. Mi-sun still wasn't speaking. But she was communicating, in the intricate private language of a child who had learned that words carry risk. She spoke in which spoon she preferred. In whether she wanted her hair braided or loose, in the way she'd tuck her feet under Aisha's thigh on the couch, and then look up with those enormous still eyes, checking. Am I still allowed to be comfortable here? Aisha always looked back. Yes. Always. Yes. Dong-yul started coming home earlier. 30 minutes at first. Then an hour. Then sometimes he was already there when she came out of the afternoon nap. Somewhere in the apartment's periphery, not intruding, just present. Learning how to be in a place where something worth coming back to existed. She rounded a corner one evening and found him crouched at Mi-sun's level in the living room. This time the girl hadn't screamed. She'd just looked at him. He'd held absolutely still, said something quiet in Korean, and Mi-sun had looked away first, but she hadn't moved away. Aisha stepped back around the corner before he could see that she'd witnessed it. She stood with her back to the wall for a moment. You fix things, he'd said at dinner the night before. I try to, she'd said. He'd looked at her for a beat too long, then looked away. She'd told herself the warmth in the back of her neck was steam from her bowl. She was lying to herself. She knew she was lying to herself. She kept doing it anyway. And then, Mi-sun had a nightmare. And everything Aisha had been carefully not feeling stopped being something she could organize away. She made one mistake that first month. She let herself love them both. The child first. Then, without planning to, the father. Aisha was asleep when she heard it. That particular drowning quality of a child trying to cry out and not quite breaking the surface. She was moving before she was fully awake. 12 years of nursing does that. Your body learns to respond before your mind has finished loading. She slid into Mi-sun's bed and pulled the girl close. Felt the small body go rigid the way they do when a nightmare still has its hands on them. And then, breath by breath, felt it loosen. She hummed. No particular song, something her own mother had done once, in a different city, that her hands and her voice had kept long after everything else had let go. Misun's breathing slowed, her fingers opened, and then, in a voice so small it barely moved the air in the room, she said it. Mama. Not half-asleep confusion, not a mistake. She said it carefully, the way children say things they've been holding, like an offering. Like a word they weren't sure they were allowed to use yet, being extended anyway because the person holding them felt like the right place to risk it. Aisha went very still. She pressed her lips to the top of Misun's head and held on and did not say anything because her throat had sealed, and anything she produced right now would not be stable. Later, Misun, long since breathing in real deep sleep, she became aware of the silence outside the door. Not the ordinary silence of a sleeping apartment. The specific silence of someone standing very still on the other side of a wall, not breathing properly. She didn't turn around. She heard him exhale. Once. The exhale of a man standing in a dark hallway, releasing something he'd been holding for a very long time. The held breath of someone who had walked into the worst winter of his life, expecting to come out of it alone, and had found, impossibly, that a light was still on. She heard him step back from the door, heard him stop before he reached the end of the hallway. And in the silence between them, a wall and a sleeping child and everything they hadn't said yet, Aisha understood that the axis of something had shifted, permanently, without asking permission. She thought that was the most dangerous thing that would happen inside these walls. She had no idea what was already inside the house with them. Here's what she didn't know about the man Dong-yul trusted most. He'd been planning this since before Aisha ever walked through the door. She noticed this vial before she noticed anything else. 12 years of emergency medicine does something to the way you see a room. You stop taking in the whole picture. You go straight to the details, the label on a bottle, the wrong angle of a held syringe. The tiny pause before someone answers a question they should already know the answer to. The security chief came into the kitchen with Misun, one large hand on the girl's small shoulder. Guidance that applied like pressure. He had a calm face. He always had a calm face. Dong-yul trusted him completely. He was the architecture of this building's safety, or was supposed to be. He set a small case on the counter, opened it, withdrew the syringe with the easy confidence of someone who had rehearsed this, and told Aisha the doctor had prescribed a mild sedative for the nightmares. Nothing heavy. Let me see the vial, Aisha said. Not a question. He paused. Half a second. The length of a man deciding whether he needed to adjust his approach. Then he held it out. She read the label, and the floor dissolved beneath her. It wasn't a sedative. The compound was wrong. The concentration was wrong. What was in that syringe didn't put people to sleep. It shut down voluntary motor function and left everything else running. The lungs, the heart, the awareness. A person given this would look like they were sleeping peacefully while every system inside them that mattered stopped, one by one, in sequence. She had seen this once. One case. 3 hours before anyone in the ER figured out what they were looking at. She had never forgotten the name on the vial. She was reading it right now. She knocked the syringe out of his hand. The sound it made hitting the marble was very small. Everything inside her chest was very loud. She pulled Misun behind her back. The same motion, automatic, absolute, the same motion from the alley. And she looked at him, and she watched his face change, and in the changing of it, she saw everything she needed to see. He knew she knew. Get out of this kitchen, she said. Her voice came out completely level. She genuinely had no idea how. He looked at her, at Misun, at Aisha again. Then he picked up the syringe, closed the case, and walked out. Aisha stood without moving until his footsteps disappeared entirely. Then she crouched to Misun's level and held the girl's face in both hands and looked at her. Carefully, methodically, the nurse brain running its checks even while the rest of her was shaking. We're okay, she said. I need to talk to your father tonight. Can you be brave a little longer? Misun looked at her with those dark, enormous eyes. nodded once. Aisha stood up, exhaled, and began calculating how to tell the most dangerous man in the city that the person he trusted most had just tried to murder his child, and had been inside the house the entire time. He thought he had organized himself against her. He was wrong. And the night he finally admitted it was the same night she almost didn't get the chance to tell him what she'd found. The evening moved the way evenings do when you're carrying something heavy, full of ordinary moments that feel surreal against what you're holding. Mi-sun needed dinner, a bath, the ritual, 3 songs, 2 stories. The window cracked exactly 1 inch because she liked cold air on her face, but not her hands. By the time Aisha came out of the bedroom, the apartment was dark except for the kitchen light. Dong-yul was there, jacket off, sleeves rolled, looking at a point somewhere beyond the counter that had nothing on it. The version of him that appeared late at night, when the managed exterior had used up all its energy. He looked up. She opened her mouth to tell him about the vial, and then she saw his face, fully, directly, nothing between it and her, and she stopped. She'd seen pieces of it before, in the hallway outside Mi-sun's door, at the dinner table, but not like this. Not the whole thing, aimed directly at her, with no distance left to hide behind. "I need to tell you something," she said. "I know," he said. "I do too." A silence that had texture. He looked at the counter, then back at her. "I don't say things like this. I don't have any practice with it." She waited. "I have been afraid twice in my life," he said. "The first time was the night they told me my wife wasn't coming home." A pause. "The second time was the night I pulled up to that alley." He stopped, started again with more care. "I thought after the first time I understood fear completely. Thought I'd taken its full measure and made my peace with it. A beat. I was wrong. Because those fears were about things I had already lost. What I felt in that alley. Seeing Mi-sun. Seeing you standing in front of her with nothing." He stopped again. "And then I saw you," he said. "Just standing there. Arms out. Nothing." The kitchen held very still. "I am not a man who is safe to love. I don't come without consequences. I know exactly what I am, and I've never once asked anyone to look past it." He met her eyes directly. "But I stopped being able to imagine this apartment without you in it, and I am not someone who ignores that kind of information." Aisha looked at him for a long moment. "Dong-yul," she said quietly, "I need to tell you about a syringe." She told him everything. The way she delivered information in the ER. Facts first, implication second. No cushioning. The vial. The compound name. What it would have done to a 6-year-old girl, and how slowly, and how it would have looked from the outside like nothing at all. The look on his security chief's face when she'd knocked it out of his hand. She watched the warmth that had just moved into Dong-yul's expression travel somewhere else entirely. What replaced it wasn't coldness. Coldness was empty. This had its own weight, its own specific gravity, something absolute and very, very quiet. He reached for his phone. She put her hand over his. "Mi-sun is asleep. She's safe right now. Whatever you're about to do it right. Not fast. Right." He looked at her hand on his, looked at her face, and she watched him pull back from the edge. Not all the way, not to somewhere gentle, but enough. Enough to be precise instead of just devastating. "In the morning," he said. "In the morning," she agreed. He didn't move for a long moment. Then he turned his hand over and held hers. Once, briefly, with a grip that carried everything he'd already said and everything he still didn't have language for. Then he let go. And she let him. She went to bed. She didn't sleep. In the morning, Dong-yul left at 8. She watched the SUVs disappear from the window and turned back toward the kitchen, and heard, 3 seconds too late, every electronic lock in the apartment engage at once. The sound was very soft, The kind of soft that is designed not to alarm anyone until alarm is no longer useful. She made one critical error. She assumed the danger was outside the building. It had been living inside it the whole time. She tried the elevator. Dark panel. The stairwell door. Sealed. She stood in the hallway and listened, and heard from the back corridor footsteps that were not the footsteps of anyone she recognized. More than two. Moving with intention. She had 90 seconds, maybe less. She went to Mi-sun's room first. The girl was already awake. She always seemed to register a change in the temperature of a room before anyone said a word about it. Aisha picked her up. Didn't run. Running scared children. Scared children made noise. Noise gave away position. She walked fast and deliberate to the room she had quietly identified 3 weeks earlier as the most defensible space in the apartment. Reinforced walls. No exterior windows. One entrance. A key code she had memorized by paying attention. She'd always been good at paying attention. She got them inside. Engaged the lock. Changed the code from the inside. 4 new digits, known to no one else. Set Mi-sun behind the heavy sectional against the far wall. Stay down and stay quiet. Can you do that? Mi-sun looked at her. Nodded. Good girl. Then Aisha turned and assessed the room the way she'd assessed every trauma bay she'd ever worked in. What do I have? What can I use? What do I make? Emergency medicine was never about waiting for the right conditions. It was about working with what existed right now, in this room, at this moment. She had a media cabinet, a first aid kit on the back wall, and 12 years of pharmaceutical knowledge that had been building this specific skill set without ever announcing it was doing so. She built what she could. She blocked the door frame with the equipment rack. She prepared 2 improvisations that would not kill anyone, but would make every person on the other side of that door deeply regret their professional choices for the next several hours. Then she wedged herself between the couch and the wall, Mi-sun pressed against her side, and she waited. She listened to them breach the outer rooms, listened to them reach the corridor, listened to them try the key code. Wrong. And try it again. Wrong. And stop trying it. The door started coming apart at the frame. She deployed the first improvisation. The sounds from the other side changed dramatically. She pulled Mi-sun closer. Face down. Don't look up until I say. Mi-sun buried her face in Aisha's chest and held on. 11 minutes away, a phone rang. A second phone. Private. The number known to exactly 4 people. One of them was already dead. One of them was calling now. The call lasted 4 seconds. He was out of the SUV before it finished stopping. He didn't take the elevator. He came up through the maintenance corridor with 3 men and the focused stillness of someone who has already decided everything that is going to happen and has moved every other thought completely out of the way. Not rage. Rage is chaotic. This was colder than rage. This was a man who had been betrayed by the person he'd trusted with the life of everyone he loved, and had clarified in 4 seconds on a phone call exactly what that was going to mean. He moved through the outer rooms without pausing, past 2 of his corrupted security team in the corridor, and noted what had happened to them and kept moving. Because what it told him, what those 2 unconscious men told him, was that she was still fighting. That she had fought. That she was still in there. That was the only information that mattered right now. The safe room door was half off its frame. He finished the work that needed to be finished in the corridor. Then he pushed the door the rest of the way open and stepped inside. She was standing. That was the first thing. That was the thing that reorganized everything inside his chest. She was on her feet. A bruise building high on her left cheekbone. A cut on her forearm that needed stitching. Her hands shaking just slightly, the way hands shake when the adrenaline finally gets the news that the emergency is over. But she was standing, and Mi-sun was behind her, face pressed into Aisha's back, 2 small fists twisted in the fabric of her shirt. Dong-yul set his weapons down. He crossed the room and put both hands on her face and looked at her, all of her, every part, methodical and desperate in equal measure. And she looked back at him, and her jaw was set, and her eyes were wet, and she didn't say a word, and neither did he, because this was not a moment that language had been designed for. He pulled her forward. He felt her exhale against his chest, the full weight of it, the release of someone who had held something enormous for a very long time and had finally found somewhere to put it down. Misan made a sound against their legs, wrapped her arms around both of them, and held on with the particular grip of a child who had decided she was not letting go of this. Not for anything. Not ever. The traitor was dealt with. The syndicate was answered to. The apartment was swept, cleared, restructured from the ground up. But the thing that happened in that safe room, the three of them, standing in the wreckage, that was not something that could be restructured. That was permanent. The nurse who had spent 12 years fixing other people's emergencies finally stopped running out of reasons to leave. December came back, the way it always does, but the penthouse was not the same place it had been a year ago. Not even close. Shoes by the door. Photographs on the walls. Real ones. Candid ones. The kind that happen when a family stops being careful and starts being a family. Music from the kitchen on weekend mornings. Misun's drawings on every surface she could reach, which turned out to be considerable. Aisha stood at the window in a gown she would never in her entire life have bought for herself. It was the kind of white that had no interest in being subtle. She'd laughed out loud the first time she put it on. She'd cried the second time and hadn't fully explained to herself why. She looked at her reflection in the window glass. She barely recognized the woman looking back. Then she recognized her completely. Both things were true. She was still figuring out how to hold them at the same time. She heard him before she turned around. He came to stand beside her at the window, and she looked at his face in the glass. That face she'd spent a year learning the full language of. Every dialect. The cold one and the careful one and the rare one that appeared at dinner when he forgot to manage himself and just existed. And he was looking at her the way he'd looked at her in the alley. Like something that had arrived in his life by breaking every rule he thought was load-bearing. He opened the box without ceremony. He was still not a man for ceremony, he never would be. The ring was extraordinary and exact, the kind of thing she would have chosen for herself, if anyone had ever asked her what she wanted. He slid it onto her finger. From across the room, in a dress she had refused to take off since dawn, on the grounds that it was her day too and she intended to be formal about it, Misan released a sound of pure triumph at a volume disproportionate to her size and launched herself across the room. Dong-yul caught her without looking, the automatic catch of a man who had spent a year building the reflex, and held her on one arm and Aisha with the other. And outside the window the snow came down, and the city below moved through its winter the way it always had, indifferent and enormous and cold. But the penthouse was warm. The little girl who had been found shaking in an alley had a home. The man who had forgotten that warmth was something a person could be permitted to keep. He had a family. And the nurse who had poured 12 years of herself into other people's crises, who had fixed strangers at 3 a.m. and walked home alone and told herself that was enough. She was home. She was finally, completely, irreversibly home. And the snow kept falling, and Misun was cheering, and Dong-yul's hand tightened around hers like a man who had decided, quietly, absolutely, without any ceremony at all, that he was never letting go. And that's where their story lands. In the warm, in the permanent. But if you've been here the whole time, if you made it through the blizzard, through the betrayal, through everything, then you already know this channel has more where that came from. Hit subscribe, drop your comment. Tell me where you're watching from. I want to say hello to every single one of you, because you're not just watching a story, you're part of how far it reaches.